Well, if that's capitalism, then what is socialism? What's to replace that? What's a better way of organizing things? Well, let me start a little bit with, I feel compelled to start with what is not socialism and say, I know I've said something on that already, but let me just say a little bit more about why Holland is not socialism. Excuse me. For the past, at least 100 years, the main examples that people have had to look to in their lives when they wanted to look to something called socialism was either some kind of what we call social democracy, that is, some kind of parliamentary socialism. A socialist politician, if you will, is elected to some high office, maybe even the highest office of the land, and then therefore you have socialism, right? You have a lot of socialists, you have a big socialist party, you have elections and the socialists win. Therefore you have socialism, right? We would say no. The other model of socialism that people have had to look to is what you could kind of say with a sweep with a broad brush, true, but I think could fall generally under the category of Stalinism. That is Castro's Cuba, Mao's China, Stalin's Russia. Those countries, so what do those have in common? Seem very different. Those countries where you have a kind of socialist bureaucrats tell you what to do. No, comrade, sorry, you cannot have that job. You must have this job. Report immediately. Welcome to your socialist paradise. Get back to work. Those societies have something in common, we would argue, and that is there's a socialist named Hal Draper who wrote back in the 70s, I want to say, a pamphlet called The Two Souls of Socialism. Marx didn't believe in the soul. The two souls of socialism, the idea is that there's that Stalinism and social democracy are of the soul, if you will, of socialism from above. That is somebody else giving you socialism. Either some kind of heroic guerrilla leader, some parliamentary politician that you are voting for, or some Stalinist bureaucrat lording over you, possibly at gunpoint. That those are the versions of socialism. They've been called socialism. People associate socialism with them in one form or another, but they all have something in common, and that is they are somebody doing the socialism for you. Somebody has set it up for you and then bestows it upon you or enforces it upon you. But this socialism of Marx and Engels, Draper writes, and I think is quite easy to show, and I will try to show, and the socialism that we in the ISO are about is a fundamentally different kind of socialism. Socialism from below, in Draper's phrase. Socialism, do-it-yourself socialism, if you will. But first of all, Marx and Engels were very clear. I mean, they said, we are not, you know, Engels wrote, we are not among those communists who want to turn the world into one huge barrack, into one huge workhouse. We have no desire to exchange freedom for equality. We are convinced that in no social order will personal freedom be assured, so assured as in a society based on communal ownership. They said, look, I believe it's the pamphlet, The Poverty of Philosophy, Engels wrote, look, you know, if state ownership was all you had to have, just have the state own everything, and then that equals socialism, then you'd have to count Metternich, you'd have to count Napoleon as among the founders of socialism, just because they, you know, the state owns everything. I work for the state. I work for the state. The state runs education to a certain degree still in this country, and I work for the state, but that doesn't mean I'm free and have socialism. Thank you very much. Well, I work for the state. I don't, you know, I'm already there. So nice. I just can't tell you. No. And so, sorry. Actually, and if you just want to say a little bit more on the question of nationalization, because it has come up quite a bit lately. Actually, there's a whole question of will they or won't they? Will the government nationalize AIG? Will the government nationalize the banks? And that's part of the whole Republican hysteria about socialism, is that that would be socialism. And that's part of how people think of it. Oh, well, if the government takes it over, then that equals socialism. I think we have to say two things about this. And then let me get to what socialism is. I'm sorry to tease you with that. But first of all, I think we have to say that what they mean by nationalization, and the nationalizations to the degree that they've already carried them out, have nothing in common with socialism, are nationalizations on their terms to try to prop up and save their system. Everything they're doing is about to try to preserve AIG in its original form and get it back to that form as quickly as possible. Everything they're doing with all of the banks is about how to get them into private. So even when they've taken over a bank, they've quickly sold it off to another bank and try to get it back into private hands as soon as possible. Obama said, himself, I'm already in the war business. I don't want to be in the auto business. Frankly, he needs to get out of the war business and get into some of these other into some of these other businesses, which is what I'll say. The other thing I think we do have to say is that we actually, I think, should argue for nationalization, though. We should talk about this. I know it could be a little confusing. I think we should argue for nationalization of things, but we should argue for a certain kind of nationalization. For example, I think we need a nationalization of our healthcare system. That one is needed badly. A national healthcare system would be a huge step forward in this country, and we should argue for that. I think we should argue for the nationalization of the banks, frankly. Banks should be set up to provide for social needs, not the kind of private wheeling and dealing that's going on now. See, part of the whole thing of nationalization, part of the reason they resist it, and part of the reason I think we have to call for it, even if we understand that it does not automatically mean socialism and that, like, it's done, we won, because we got nationalization, even if we understand that. The reason to argue for nationalization is, first of all, it takes things out of private hands, that is unaccountable hands, that is behind closed doors hands, and puts it out in front of all of us to see. And the whole idea is that now you're accountable to us. Now you're accountable to the taxpayer. That's why they're whining and crying about the bonuses, is because we know what the bonuses are. Whoever knew what the bonuses were? We didn't really know. We didn't even know AIG. I never heard of AIG. But now everybody's heard of AIG. All their faces are in the newspaper every day. This guy took a jet to Washington. Can you believe that? It's like they take jets everywhere. But the fact now that they have to apologize for taking a jet, that's why they don't want nationalization. Because they want this, they want AIG to be theirs to make the decisions. They want all of the institutions of society to be theirs to own privately. And it's none of your business what they do with it. What we say is nationalization puts everything that they do out before us as a publicly accountable operation. That is, the point of having schools ought to be to teach something, not to make a buck. The point of providing health care ought to be to heal people, not to make a buck out of denying people health. The point ought to be not to have the market rule it and it to be private and unaccountable. The point ought to be to do things that people need doing and do them in the light of day, accountable to the public. So those are the reasons. It's a huge stab at the whole free market ideology, is what I'm saying. That's why I think we actually should argue for nationalization, even if we understand that it's not automatically, some kind of socialism. So what is socialism? I think, in a phrase, if you had to sum it up, socialism, and if you take nothing else from what I'm ranting on about, take this: that socialism is workers' power. Socialism would be a system where we do the work, like we do now, but we also have all the say. That is, we're the workers and the bosses. And that's quite hard to imagine. That's not just electing somebody to power. That means we would have power every day in our workplaces, in our communities, in our schools and institutions. And it's a radical democracy, really. It's a way to think of it. Right now, we have a very limited democracy. Right now, what does really our democracy consist of? Harvard or Yale. It's like Skull and Bones or more Skull. That's who we elect. That's part of why Obama's appeal is that he was just not Skull and Bones for once. We have a system where actually all we do is get to vote on which politician sits in this office, but when you go to work, and by the way, you spend most of your time at work, your work determines everything about your life, determines your stress, your free time, your quality of life, your children's life, everything really about your life is determined by work. When you show up at work, ain't no democracy. Work is an autocracy. Work is where they tell you what to do or else. And so we really have a very narrow and limited democracy, and so socialists actually aim to explode that open and make the workplace democratic. Not just one workplace or some workplaces, but all of the workplaces, and frankly, all of the work of society. That we would be the masters of it in addition to the people that do it. Marx said, and I really, honestly, I believe that this idea is still a very radical idea. It's still very radical, and it's especially the socialism from below aspect of it. I was watching the